Industrialization had many long-term effects, some intended, some unintended. Pollution became a fact of urban life, with smokestacks billowing dust and ash into the atmosphere. Working conditions were often poor. Mass production rendered many skilled workers, those same apprentices or masters in the guild system, obsolete, compelling them to join the mass ranks of unskilled and poorly paid labor. Through much of the 19th century, there were virtually no protections in place for workers. No workers' compensation, no employer or state-mandated health insurance, no unemployment insurance, no social security. Unions, to the extent that they existed at all, were weak. Such exploitation was bound to have an effect on politics, and in the early 19th century saw the beginnings of a new ideology called socialism. Support for equality of outcome, rather than equality before the law, had long antecedents. During the French Revolution, the Jacobins imposed heavy controls on the sale of food and other basic necessities, insisting that everyone had the right to be fed. Parisians, regardless of rank or income, received the same bread rations. And though the rich complained, the food shortages imposed by the war did not result in mass starvation. But it was the devastation wrought by factories that gave impetus to ideas that wage labor itself was wrong, that no one had any right to own the means of production. Critics of capitalism contended that it contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. It would reduce ever more people to the status of poorly paid laborers until there was no one left who could afford to buy capitalism's products. To Karl Marx, a German journalist living in exile in London, this made the collapse of capitalism inevitable. Marx argued that economic development proceeded in stages. The feudalism of the Middle Ages gave way to capitalism, which would give way to socialism. In his Communist Manifesto, Marx argued that all history is the result of class struggle. The bourgeoisie, what we might define as the middle class, had overthrown the feudal aristocracy to create capitalism, which in turn would be dominated by the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a broad term that can be reduced largely to factory workers. Should the workers of the world unite, as Marx insisted at the end of his manifesto, the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie and impose socialism. This was not democracy. Marx claimed that a dictatorship of the proletariat would be needed to eliminate the bourgeoisie. But once people adapted to the new system and held goods in common, the fruits of industrial life would be available to all. Since governments do nothing but enforce the power of one class over another, a government would eventually no longer be necessary and would wither away. This utopian vision was what Marx referred to as communism. Marx published his Communist Manifesto in 1848. There were revolutions all over Europe that year, mostly in the name of overthrowing kings and princes. Socialists participated. After all, overthrowing feudalism was one step closer to victory over capitalism, but they were not the most important faction in any of them. This was disappointing for Marx. Not only did he believe that revolution was inevitable, but he believed it to be imminent. He insisted that his analysis was scientific. Society followed laws of economic development, and the path to socialism was a natural outgrowth of those laws. But 50 years after the Communist Manifesto was published, there was no sign of any successful revolution. Marx had died in 1883, and after his death, his followers split into two camps. One insisted the route to socialism was more gradual than Marx had thought, and need not occur in a violent revolution. It could occur democratically. Socialist parties had begun participating in elections and could win support by passing legislation alleviating the plight of workers. This faction was particularly strong in Germany, where the SPD, or Social Democratic Party, was the largest party in the German Reichstag by 1914. But gains for workers might in practice reduce the demand for socialism, since workers would be satisfied with existing gains and might decline to move further. This was certainly the hope of conservative elites like Otto von Bismarck, who introduced the world's first social security system for retirees. For a more radical faction of Marxists, gradualism was the enemy of the working class. This radical faction was also aware that demand for violent revolution was fading. Intellectuals like Vladimir Lenin thought this was because the working class would never develop a revolutionary consciousness on their own. They would be content, as he put it, to join a trade union and receive more pay, with creature comforts defeating the possibility of real change. To overcome this reality, Lenin insisted that the working class should be led to socialism, by force if necessary, by a dedicated vanguard of revolutionaries, a group to which he would include himself. Lenin had been born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov to a well-to-do Russian family in 1870. He was set on a revolutionary course after his brother had been executed for participating in a conspiracy to murder the Tsar, and would himself be sent into internal exile in Siberia near the river Lena, from which he took his nom de guerre, Lenin. Released from the Tsarist-era gulag, Lenin moved to Switzerland, where he rapidly became involved with the Russian Social Democratic Party, most of whose leadership was in foreign exile. Like most socialist parties at the turn of the century, the Social Democratic Party was divided between moderate and radical wings. Moderates preferred to work within the system as possible, and radicals wanted violent revolution, conducted of course by that revolutionary vanguard. Lenin was decidedly in the latter camp, and forced to vote on which policy to pursue. Lenin lost, but called his faction the Bolsheviks, or majority, and formally split from the Social Democratic Party. He called the others the Mensheviks, or minority, and even though the Mensheviks won the vote, they rather stupidly began calling themselves the Mensheviks, one of many decisions that would later doom them to defeat. Lenin disagreed with other aspects of orthodox Marxism as well. Marx thought that a revolution could only succeed in a highly developed capitalist economy, one much like Germany. He did not think it would succeed in Russia, which he believed was too backward and too feudal to sustain a revolution. He insisted instead that it would have to proceed through a capitalist stage first. At the end of the 19th century, there was some industrialization in Russia. Huge factories opened in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and a class of industrial workers did exist, though it was smaller than similar groups elsewhere in Europe. But Russia's politics encouraged underground radicalism. In 1900, the Tsar, Nicholas II, was an absolute ruler, with no assembly or system of rights to check his autocratic power. Serfdom, effective slavery for peasants, had only been abolished in 1862. Russia's political institutions were thoroughly underdeveloped, and its military prowess not far behind. When Japan and Russia went to war in 1904, the Japanese easily smashed the Russian army and navy. This led to revolutionary upheaval in Russian cities, especially St. Petersburg, where a crowd of demonstrators who sought to deliver a petition to the Tsar was fired upon by Russian troops. Nicholas II agreed to some concessions, allowing the creation of a National Assembly, or Duma, but he still kept much of his grip on power. This might have been sustainable for a while, had it not been for the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Russia backed the Allies, but was no match for German troops. The Russian army was nearly annihilated at the Battle of Tannenberg not long after the war began. The war devastated the Russian economy, and with the Tsar unwilling to reform the army or alleviate widespread hunger, the stage was set for a revolutionary showdown. Frustrated with limited progress in the war, Tsar Nicholas II traveled to the front to personally take command. In his absence, events soon spiraled out of control. When he attempted to return in February 1917 to St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd since St. Petersburg sounded too German, his path was blocked by demonstrators. He attempted to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexei, but the revolutionary crowds demanded the total overthrow of the monarchy. A republic was established, governed by the liberal Alexander Kerensky. Censorship was lifted, a Bill of Rights was prepared, and many Russians looked forward to a much freer era. But Kerensky would not back out of the war. He believed Russia should not abandon its Western allies. And the war would go no better for Russia under his command. A June offensive in 1917 would collapse, and a growing chorus of left-wing radicals began demanding peace at any cost. Kerensky rapidly lost control of events. In February 1917, he agreed to share power in Russian cities with Soviets, or elected workers' councils, believing that this direct democracy marked a repudiation of Tsarist autocracy. But the Soviets demanded the right to veto any act of the Duma, or National Assembly, believing themselves to be the authentic voice of the people. From exile in Switzerland, Lenin promoted these views, insisting all power to the Soviets. Knowing that Lenin was among those who demanded peace at any cost, the German government arranged to transport him to Russia on a sealed train, from which he disembarked at the Finland station in Petrograd on April 3, 1917. But to Lenin, all power to the Soviets meant all power to the Revolutionary Vanguard, a communist party that would bring Russia from its near-feudal stage to the socialist stage. And in October 1917, he and his supporters launched a coup that would bring them into power. The October Revolution, as it came to be known, marked the beginning of the Soviet Union, which continued to exist until 1991. It was the world's first avowedly socialist state, and in its early years it had to struggle for survival against any manner of enemies. Lenin swiftly eliminated his rivals on the left. He allowed elections not long after his coup on the premise that the Bolsheviks would win, and when they didn't, a faction of Mensheviks known as the Socialist Revolutionary Party did. Lenin dismissed the Duma and created a one-party state, one governed by the Bolsheviks, who were not long after renamed the Communist Party. A wide variety of factions then declared war on the Soviet state. These came to be known as the White Russians, and included everyone from anarchists to czarists. The Whites would lose to the Communists, who, like other socialist parties, adopted the color red in honor of workers killed by the bourgeoisie. Lenin and his acolyte, Leon Trotsky, campaigned on a platform of land, peace, and bread, though this platform hardly prevented Trotsky from burning whole villages and forcing men into the Red Army. The Soviets ended the war with Germany, ceding vast tracts of Western Russia to German armies in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In Lenin's view, such concessions were to provide a breathing space for the Soviets to defeat their internal rivals. And anyway, it didn't matter, since a workers' revolution would soon occur in Germany and everywhere else, thus expanding the Soviet Union into Central Europe. That obviously didn't happen. Revolutions in Berlin, Bavaria, and Hungary ultimately failed, and in 1920 the Soviets were pushed out of a formerly Russia-controlled Poland. But the Soviets did defeat the Whites, and in 1922 a union of Soviet Socialist republics was formally established. It was a one-party state, governed by Lenin, but economic devastation had reaped a grim toll on the economy. Things were so bad that Lenin proposed his new economic policy, a form of small-scale capitalism that allowed farmers to sell their surplus and small businesses to compete with each other. But Lenin's death in 1924 opened a succession struggle among the leadership of the Communist Party. Though Trotsky was thought by many to be Lenin's chosen successor, he was rapidly sidelined by his Georgian colleague, Joseph Dukashvili, who preferred to call himself Joseph Stalin, Russian for steel. Stalin had spent the years before 1917 in and out of exile, robbing banks to make money and serving as a kind of enforcer. Skilled above all at political intrigue, Stalin would eliminate all of his rivals during the late 1920s for leadership in the party. He abandoned Lenin's new economic policy in favor of central planning, imposing 5-year plans on Soviet industry and agriculture. He forced peasants to leave their lands for collective farms, contributing in the process to what became known as the Holodomor, a devastating famine in the Ukraine that killed millions. The Soviet Union would rapidly industrialize under his leadership, but state and society were governed by terror. Constant purges, even of loyal party comrades, was a fact of life under Stalin. As we'll see in class, victory in World War II would extend communism deep into Central Europe, setting the stage for a Cold War between capitalism and communism. It would dominate world affairs for the second half of the 20th century.